Hey guys, Mr. Davis here. I'm going to go over a quick presentation that'll give you a rundown on aquatic ecosystems. I'm going to try and be fast about this. I'm going to try and cover the critical information. We will definitely continue to talk about aquatic ecosystems. They are my favorite, so I will try to keep this limited to the pertinent information and not just tell you all of the cool things that I could talk about for hours that happens underwater because this is my thing. This is what makes me happy. This is the kind of stuff that I think is just the coolest in the world. So without further ado, let me see if I can give you guys a good, consistent, solid rundown on environmental issues with aquatic ecosystems, basically how the biomes work, without going too overboard. All right, so to start off, let's divide them up into the big categories of marine ecosystems and freshwater ecosystems. So the marine ecosystems are your saltwater, ocean, the different seas, that kind of thing. All right. They can include estuaries, salt marshes, salt swamps, which, a lot of times that's a mangrove forest. The intertidal zone, the neritic zone, which can also include coral reefs, and then the oceanic zone, which is then divided up into the photic, aphotic, and benthic areas. All right. Then we have the freshwater ecosystems, which are ponds, lakes, streams, rivers, swamps, and marshes. And then bogs are kind of a type of marsh as well. And I will explain those differences to you in just a second. So I actually do want to start with the freshwater ecosystems. So first off, some key things to know about freshwater ecosystems. There's a wide variation in flow rate, the current, if you will. You have some rivers and streams that flow extremely fast. You have some that flow much slower, and they can flow at different rates in different places in these streams and rivers. You can have a pretty wide difference in temperature. And generally speaking, in freshwater ecosystems, there is a negligible salinity. And salinity is the measure of how salty water is. And I put that in quotation marks because it's not just table salt, sodium chloride, which is the majority of seawater, but it's really just saying dissolved ionic compounds. Okay? So there is generally less dissolved stuff in freshwater. You will have varying levels of sedimentation depending on how fast that's flowing, if it's a pond or river, things like that. But they do supply fresh water to terrestrial ecosystems as well. And that's a really important provisioning and regulating ecosystem service that is provided. All right. So wetlands, and here's some of their general ecosystem services. Inland wetlands are areas that are covered with fresh water all or some of the time. They provide some really critical services. They're a important habitat for game fish, mammals, and birds. A lot of times they are nursery habitats where these things go to spawn and have their offspring. They're actually able to filter toxic wastes, both naturally occurring and artificially created. Many of the plants in these areas can actually break down these chemicals very safely. They can also break down excess nutrients from runoff from feedlots or other agricultural businesses. They basically concentrate all this stuff there. The plants are really good at soaking it up, breaking it down to stuff that's less harmful, or just binding it up and keeping it out of the biosphere for a good long time. They also help reduce flooding because they basically absorb stormwater. And on the other side of it, as they soak up that stormwater, as they keep that in the ground, they keep that in the low-lying areas, they're also a source of fresh water for streams that run out of these wetlands during dry spells. So they're a place where there's water regularly, and it kind of evens out the highs and lows of problems you get with precipitation. There's plenty of foods that we get from them. Cranberries, blueberries, shellfish, rice, timber. These are all products that we get from wetlands still to this day. And then there's recreational for fishing, boating, bird watching. It's estimated by the Florida Academy of Sciences that more than $5 billion a year are generated by local wetlands just from those kinds of services, not including what they save us by preventing floods. And To that end, I've got a little picture here. This is the Morris Bridge well field, which used to be drawn from heavily for water for the city of Tampa. A project that I was actually on sought to reduce the overdraw of that. This is the same picture. This tree right here is this one right here, and you can see that there is quite a difference there because we were able to limit the amount of water that was being pulled out of this wetland. Um, Really, really helpful thing. All right, let's go ahead. Move on to the next one. So let's talk about a swamp. All right, so it's a type of wetland is a swamp. These are essentially a forest with water permanently or semi-permanently saturating the soil. They have large woody plants and typically a slow flow rate of water through them. What this means is that you're going to get areas like this where it will look kind of like a lake with trees growing out of it. You may have periods of time where the ground appears dry, but it's like squishy and muddy. Um, Water does move through swamps. It comes in usually from a river or streams or things like that, and then it does drain out of the swamp closer to lower elevations, things like that. But it moves very slowly through that swamp and has a lot of opportunities for any sediment that it's carrying, any mud or things like that, to settle out, get hung up on those trees, and it can actually help purify and clean the water as a result. All right, so a second type of wetland is going to be a marsh. Now, the difference between a marsh and a swamp is that marshes are covered by species of reeds and grasses. And if you look at these images, what you can see is that the plants here are much thinner. You don't have the tall trees. You've got kind of these clumpy little bush shrub type things. And in a marsh, what you're going to get is a lot smaller vegetation. Here you are going to have a number of organisms like cranes and egrets and storks that are able to walk and look above that marshland. You're going to have organisms and small fish that swim through these reeds. The soil is again permanently or semi-permanently saturated with water, and they're often found at the edges of lakes or rivers where water flow is slowed and you get a lot of sedimentation. You can even get them in areas where the river overflows its banks very regularly and maintains a wetland habitat around the river continuously. And again, that goes back to that ecosystem service of regulating water flow and being a place for the water to go to so that it has time to be absorbed, evaporate, soak into the ground, and prevent flooding either downstream or overland and destroy areas. So those are marshes. Lastly, what I want to talk about is something called a bog. So what is the difference between a marsh, a swamp, and a bog? Well, bogs still have abundant water, but the soil is poor quality. All right. There is insufficient nutrients, either not enough nitrogen, not enough phosphorus, or the carbon cycle is so slow that that material just can't be taken up. All right. So there's abundant water, but poor soil. So you don't get a good forest forming. You don't get a good grassland forming. You just get this swampy, muddy, gross area. It's typified by wood or grasses that when they die, the poor soil and low oxygen environment discourages that decomposition. Soils and water are typically of a lower pH, so they're acidic, and that acidic nature may also be part of the reason why some things can't grow there, because if the soil is too acidic, plants cannot do a very good job of taking up or taking in the dissolved minerals that are in there. The dissolved minerals want to stay in solution. They don't want to be absorbed by the plants. Um, and these are often formed over thousands of years as plant matter and sediment accumulate in a lake and eventually fill it in. So a pretty common way that these form is you start with a lake and you just get a continuous amount of stuff flowing or flooding into it, and it just fills up with more and more and more sediment, and eventually it just all just gets trapped there. And this picture that I have over here, what that's showing is how over thousands of years, from 7,000 BC to present, what you have is this accumulation of that undecayed, just kind of compacted and squished and like gross and waterlogged organic matter or peat forming. All right. And this is actually how a lot of archaeology has been done in Ireland specifically. So that's where this image is from. It's from looking specifically at peat bogs that form in Ireland as a result of lots of water but poor quality soil in those areas. All right, next up, rivers and streams. Okay, so we were looking at wetlands where we have a low flow rate. Now let's look at rivers and streams where you're going to have a higher flow rate and you're going to have water moving quickly. Here, you have to have animals that are adapted to fighting against a current. They have to be able to resist that current in some way so they don't just get washed out to sea. This could mean that they've got hooks or suckers that allow them to attach to rocks, like a lot of fish and insects do, or they have to have very streamlined bodies where they can efficiently swim upstream. So here, especially in fast-moving streams, fast-moving rivers, you don't get a lot of primary productivity happening there because it's just moving too fast for plants to be able to grow reliably. You get few plants, a little bit of algae sometimes, but those strong currents a lot of times will limit that. So they rely heavily on inputs from seeds, leaves, or even insects or small animals falling into that river or trying to cross that river. All right, that's the major inputs for the trophic pyramid for fast-moving rivers and streams. In slower moving rivers and streams, you get this thing called a watershed, and that's where you have a large body of land that drains into a deep river channel that moves more slowly. Now here, you can get an accumulation of nutrients and you can start getting more primary productivity. Large rivers in particular can have a higher primary productivity due to shoreline plants. They can also have a large amount of algae or plankton floating in that water. Now, plankton is a term that we're going to talk about more with the ocean, but essentially this is any organisms that just float in the water column and go with the flow. Most phytoplankton, which is photosynthetic plankton, are microscopic single-celled protists. They're not plants, but they photosynthesize like plants. This can include amoebas. This can include any number of things like that. And this is sometimes pond scum, seaweed. It's called different things. So a couple river and stream organisms that you can see here. I've shown you these guys before. Amphibians, they need to breed in water. So a lot of times rivers and streams are their nursery habitats. So they're very important for controlling insects, but we could lose them if we dam up too many rivers and streams. Trout is a commercially available fish, but it is also an important stepping stone in that trophic pyramid. And then you've got otters. You can see they have a streamlined body for swimming after those fish and swimming upstream. And these are just some of the organisms that you would find in a river. And you could find these in North American rivers pretty readily. All right, so then let's shift to ponds and lakes. Now, ponds and lakes are on the other side. So you've got kind of a balancing act here of flow. All right, so you've got rivers and streams that are generally faster, a little bit more movement. You've got wetlands where you have a slower flow rate, but it does still move. But then you've got ponds and lakes, and these are bodies of standing or still fresh water for the most part. Lakes are generally larger and deeper than ponds. Ponds are generally shallow enough for sunlight to hit the bottom, allowing plants to grow there. Very large ponds and lakes are generally too deep for plants to grow on the bottom at their deepest areas. All right, so you get algae that grows and floats on the surface. All right, looking at these, you have your littoral zone, which is near the shallow water to a depth where plants can get rooted to fairly easily. Then you've got your limetic zone, which is the open area, the out away where it's the water's too deep for plants to root to the bottom and grow to the surface, but you still have an area near the surface where there's enough light, and that's where you'll get photosynthetic plankton. Again, microscopic floating organisms, and this is also where a lot of big fish will live, because you have large fish like paddlefish and things like that that'll swim through there and eat that plankton. Then you've got fish that eat them. This is where you get your big fish in rivers, lakes, ponds, streams, things like that. Mostly ponds and lakes, swimming through this area. Then lastly, you've got your profundal and benthic zones. Now these areas are dark. All right, they're dark and they don't allow for photosynthesis. A lot of times, as a result, they can also be a lower oxygen environment because they don't allow for photosynthesis. You don't have plants producing oxygen down there, but you do have bacteria that are feeding on the waste from those plants dying and sinking to the bottom, waste from the fish that eat the plants, waste from things that wash down into the river or stream or fall in. All right. As a result of this low oxygen environment, you can get slow breakdown. It can be very cold down there, and stuff can last at the bottom for a very long period of time sometimes. Um, you've got two general categories, oligotrophic and eutrophic. These are the far ends of the spectrum. Oligotrophic lakes and ponds means that it has very low nutrients, the water is extremely clear, and there's very little plant growth in there to cloud that water column in any way, shape, or form. Oligotrophic is generally more clear. Eutrophic has a lot more nutrients, but to the point where it chokes out that pond. There's actually too many nutrients and there are too many plants there. So this can kill off fish too. All right. You can have too much plant being produced there. Those plants will sink to the bottom. And again, they break down and the bacteria eat up all the oxygen and nothing can survive. So these are like opposite ends of a spectrum here, and you can end up with an imbalance either way, and you can end up with a dead lake either way. All right, so somewhere in the middle is generally where those lakes need to be. All right, some quick organisms that you find here. So first off, you have things like carp and turtles because they don't have to fight current. They can hang out there, do a little better. You've got lily pads with frogs on them here in the middle. And then you got the Loch Ness Monster there on the side. But, this really isn't accurate because the loch is not a lake. It seems like a lake, but it's actually a deep inlet from the ocean. So that's why, you get things like that there.